I guess. So cultivation is in this room, and then what's in the other room, Aaron? The tarping, mulching, and anaerobic weed control. I'm more familiar with aerobic, step aerobic. Okay, so cultivation. I've done a fair amount of work with cultivation research, and you'll see I've got this GoPro camera here that I strap onto the cultivator. It helps me learn about how the cultivator is working and how to adjust it most effectively. I'll start out talking about basic row cultivation. So this is row cultivation in soybeans with kind of a typical 5 S-time cultivator, and working pretty well here. Adjustment is hugely important in cultivation, as you probably know. Yeah, a lot of these typical 5-tine or 5 S-tines here will have kind of shanks and shovels, and then maybe a duck's foot sweep in the middle. And these, as you know, these wear down over time, over acreage. After, depending on your acreage, number of fields or number of years, they'll get skinnier. And so they'll let weeds through these gaps, unfortunately. So you got to keep an eye on the width of these blades. And some of them are designed to wear down and hold their width. Those are the ones that I tend to prefer, because they don't change dramatically in the overlap of the blades and the sweeps over time. The other thing I want to mention here is this gauge wheel, which obviously keeps the tools at the right level. Depending on the size of the weeds, very small weeds, I like to shoot for as shallow cultivation as possible. Larger weeds toward the end of the season, maybe get down to 3 inches or so. But early season and some of the lighter weight tools I'll show you later, you're actually shooting for about a 1/2 inch penetration with the depth. Which weeds are susceptible to cultivation? I've kind of gone through and ranked here. Cotyledon stage weeds, so tiny weeds that the first leaf, the seed leaves that pop out of the ground. They're not true leaves, but these are minuscule weeds. In fact, if you're just kind of walking along, you might not even see them, because they're just smaller than a penny. Small annual broadleaves are still pretty darn susceptible. After that, grasses. I think grasses are harder to control with cultivation than broadleaves. They're a little bit more strongly rooted, and like Aaron was mentioning earlier, the growing point is a little bit more protected with the grasses, and it's harder to sever them. You're not going to separate the shoot growing point from the root growing point as easily with the grasses. Perennials are then a little bit more challenging to control. You might have a chance of controlling them with one shot if they're young, if they're newly established perennials, right from seed or a small root fragment. But if they're large perennials, if they're established, and the same with large annuals, it's going to take a few passes with cultivation to control those, if you're lucky. Yeah, so larger weeds, a lot of times you'll undercut them, and yeah, you'll move them, maybe flip them over, but they'll just reroot. They've got enough stored energy inside the leaves, inside the roots, that they can survive out of the soil for a few hours and maybe a few days, depending on size. And then the perennials just have so much stored energy that even if you completely remove the top growth, they'll just send up a new shoot from all the energy down below. So the timing is hugely important to get these weeds when they're small. So I have 2 different studies here. The first one is with between row cultivation. So like the cultivator I showed in the first picture, kind of a typical row cultivator, very aggressive between the row. And this is the efficacy, the kill rate for cotyledon stage. Yeah, I mean, you should be killing pretty close to 100% of those. Down to 4, 5, 6 leaf stage, efficacy drops down to maybe below 80%. And then for in-row weeds, there's in-row tools that are much more flexible, and they can't be very aggressive or they'll take out the crop. So the in-row tools have to be kind of gentle. And so this curve here, this line drops very quickly for the in-row tools. And you really have to be getting these weeds at the cotyledon stage. And just to compare, this is only cotyledon at 3, 4 leaf stage. And this is really pushing it. This is with a very aggressive in-row weeder. Most of them wouldn't even be that effective. So timing is huge. Just some background for cultivation. When you're cultivating, you're typically killing weeds in one of 3 ways, or perhaps some combination of these 3 ways. So cutting the weeds at the base, separating the root growing points from the shoot growing points, will typically kill small weeds. Oh, this is the one I'll keep the volume. Okay, great. Uprooting. Yeah, a lot of these tools will kind of lift up or, kind of pull the weeds out of the ground, exposing the roots to the sunlight where they'll dry out, they'll desiccate and hopefully die. And then burying. If you're able to prevent the leaves of small weeds from collecting the sun's rays, they can't produce food and they'll die after a few days or a week, depending on the size. So this is a video I put together to illustrate these.
These little weeds just emerged. They're still in the cotyledon stage. And these early stages, they are really the most vulnerable that they will ever be. So when you're hoeing, you actually tend to be burying, cutting, and uprooting weeds. And each of these is most effective on small weeds. When small weeds like this lamb's quarters are buried with ½ an inch of soil, they usually won't be able to push through the sunlight. Whereas burying this larger lamb's quarters isn't going to work as well. Next, cutting. Cutting at the base will kill most small annual broadleaf weeds like this ragweed. But this larger ragweed will probably be able to send out new branches. And it looks like it was actually mowed earlier this summer and already recovered. Now, uprooting. Small uprooted weeds tend to dry out very quickly in the sun. And I don't think this small gallon soda will recover. This medium-sized gallon soda might bounce back if it got some rain right away. But this larger gallon soda, I think, may be able to reroot and recover even if it doesn't rain.
Great. Yeah, so for all 3 of these mechanisms, I'm not saying anyone should go out there with scissors. I'm just saying for cultivation, you're cutting, you're uprooting, you're burying. So all three of those are happening, and they're all most effective on small, very, very small weeds. So to get small weeds, it can be hard, a hard thing to achieve, and especially if when cultivating, you need your crop to be established. You need your crop to be at least foot tall or so. And how do you get small weeds at the same time? Well, light tillage, flaming, or pre-emergence herbicides used immediately prior to planting can give your crop a head start, so that when you finally do cultivate, your crop is big and the weeds are small. That's the conditions you want. Transplanting can also give you those conditions. as can reducing your weed seed bank, as I talked about earlier, before you even plant. So, some farmers will think about, they'll know they got to get ready for some, puny little crop like beets or carrots, and they'll see that a couple of years ahead of time, and they'll say, okay, I got to get this seed bank drawn down to prepare for that. Nothing against carrots. Loose and level soil is really critical for optimal cultivation. A nice seed bed or high soil organic matter can keep the soil loose, keeping it from getting too crusty. Minimal stone is great if you can have it, if you have it. And on a hot sunny day is really best, so that if you're uprooting and those roots are exposed to the sun, that they dry out as quickly as possible. Okay, gonna transition into in-row cultivation. As you see here, a lot of our typical between-row cultivators, they miss this in-row zone. They just totally leave it undisturbed. There's some things that I'll talk about, some ways to address that. One is you think about your spacing, from an agronomic standpoint, for the plant health, it might be optimal if each plant had, a perfect amount of space around it. But for cultivating, we want as few rows as possible. It's hard to control the weeds in here, so we want as few as possible. Nice wide rows, densely spaced or densely planted within the row. And then if they're densely planted, the crop will hopefully help us by suppressing weeds in that row as well. And we need straight roads. This is where GPS can come in handy. At the research farm, we just got one a couple of years ago, and it's been a huge help. Keeping the rows straight means you can cultivate closer to the row. The easiest way to adjust your cultivator is just by driving slower or driving faster. Here on the left, we're going pretty slow, maybe 1 or 2 miles per hour, and we're not throwing any soil near that base. There's no disturbance in the inner 4 or 5 inches of the crop row. Whereas on the right, we picked up speed, 3 or 4 miles per hour maybe, and we're throwing a little bit of soil, just the right amount, not so much that we're smothering the crop, but enough to get pretty close in there and bury some of the small weeds. This is one of the most common in-row cultivation tools, kind of a blind cultivation tool, they call it, because you're not looking at the row. Tor talked about this. This is the one he used in his wheat, a springtime harrow. And it really just, again, it relies on that size differential. You need a big crop, well rooted in, and hopefully you've done your homework ahead of time with pre-emergence herbicides or other means, and the weeds are a lot smaller than the crop. It's not magic. If the weeds in the crop are the same size, then you're going to be killing them both at the same rate. Now, there are some other more recent developments in terms of in-row weed control, and these are a few of them, all used on the same cultivator, torsion weeders, finger weeders, and kind of a mini harrow here. And these tools all require accurate steering. I'll talk at the end about different ways you can accurately steer these cultivators. But this is something that we're calling stacking, using not just one of these, but several of these different cultivation tools, and they each do a little bit different things. Here, the torsion weeder is kind of undercutting, the finger weeder is uprooting, and then the harrow is kind of burying. So all 3 of those mechanisms that I was talking about earlier, and we found actually synergy. These tools work better together than you would have expected based on each one by itself. But what we didn't do so well in that video, you might have been feeling for the corn there. Ouch! Yeah, it was more like this middle scenario than what we want to see, which is on the right here. We want these tools to be selective. We want these tools to be pulling out as many of the in-row weeds as possible while leaving our crop unharmed. And so in the next set of trials at Cornell and at Michigan State, we changed some things, and we got rid of the torsion weeders. They were a little bit hard to adjust, and switch those out with just regular sweeps. The finger weeders, we pulled them. We gave the crop more space, more room to breathe. We pulled them wider from the crop. We took out these center tines. This row harrow actually had tines that were just wreaking havoc on the crop. So we took those center tines out. We left the ones on the side. And we also checked out this little 6-inch disc that did some hilling on the in-row zone. And in Michigan, the results were all kind of all over the board. But yeah, again, we tested single tools by themselves, as well as 2 tool combinations, and then 1 3-tool combination. The light gray is the weed mortality. So we want to see 100% weed mortality in 2016 and in 2017. The black is our crop mortality. We want 0 crop mortality, and it was pretty high in some cases. So that was Michigan, and they were just kind of testing out the tools. Some of them are missing there where we weren't able to implement those. In New York, with Cornell, we did more of a full trial, and again we're tested out single tools, so just sweeps. Used maybe like 6-7 inches from the crop, and then sweeps used closer to the crop, maybe 5 inches on either side, a 5-inch space or gap for the crop to go through. Plus sweeps sweeps fingers, sweeps harrow, sweeps disc, and then these 3-tool combinations here. And you can see the trend, which makes sense. As you add more tools, the effectiveness, the weed control increased. Duh. But the cool thing was that the crop mortality stayed the same, so it didn't really increase. And this is just the statistics showing that. But yeah, so this was pretty encouraging result. Close over 80% weed control, and I didn't mention this is just in the in-row zone, so just in the 4-inch in-row band here. So we were over the moon about this, getting 80% or better weed control in that in-row band. But this is snap beans. Now they've got a big seed. They pop out of the ground, and they're pretty quickly a foot tall. And in one of these trials, the weeds were slow. We had some drought, so the conditions were perfect for cultivation. I can't take all the credit for this result. A lot of it was due to the weather. So we really wanted to try to put this cultivator through the paces and test it out in a more challenging crop. So we tried beets, which is smaller seeded, slower out of the ground. Typically the weeds are right behind the beets, or maybe even in front of the beets. And we tested it first at the 2-leaf stage. Ouch. Too early. Can't in-row cultivate 2-leaf stage beets. I wouldn't recommend it. That was unacceptable crop damage there. But when we went to the 4-leaf stage here, this is a new graph, 4-leaf stage. Well, some of these might be acceptable. We really want to see less than 10% for sure. Some of these got that. I'm going to separate this out by the year. The results were a little bit different in each year. First, looking at 2018, formatting got messed up, but basically the stacked combinations of the 3 tools killed the most weeds, but didn't have any difference. There was no difference in terms of the crop mortality. So there was a benefit to stacking in terms of your selectivity. How well you're able to pull those weeds out from the in-row zone without killing the crop. 2019, a little bit different, but same trend. Yeah, sorry, the formatting, but A here means that the stacked tools had statistically the greatest weed control efficacy. And again, there was no difference in terms of crop mortality. So there's again a benefit to stacking and using these 2 or 3 tool combinations here. Then we graphed all the results over the whole season and the New York and the Michigan results. And so we calculated the crop mortality based on the number of passes it would take to get 80% weed control. So we want low crop mortality. If assuming we're getting 80% weed control, this is just in the row. Between the row, it's going to be much higher. What's the maximum crop mortality you're going to accept? Would you accept 5% crop mortality if you're able to kill 80% of the in-row weeds? 5%? That might be okay, right? So going across here, taking 5% where it hits the line. This is the 3 tool combinations. So for the 3 tool combinations, you need a crop to weed height ratio of 4. So the crop has to be 4 times the size of the weed to achieve 80% weed control and while only doing 5% crop damage. And with these 1 and 2 tool combinations, you got to be 6 times, at least 6 times as tall as the weeds. So that's a pretty tall order. To get the crop up 6 times as big as the weeds before you're doing these in-row cultivations. So you're really going to need to do the homework ahead of time with pre-emergence, with seed bank management to establish those conditions. This is a slow motion video. I mentioned that GoPro earlier, and most of you on your smartphone, you have a slow motion setting, and I highly recommend if you're doing tillage or if you want to look at what's happening with your cultivator, you can really see nicely what's going on here. And this is one of the most effective combinations. Sweeps are up front, kind of loosening things, fingers, uprooting weeds, and then some burial going on. And I've got a 30-minute video with 15 different cultivators from across the state and this slow motion footage of each cultivator and suggestions about how to improve the adjustment of each one. Let's hit this button again. You don't have to go out and buy a fancy new cultivator to do this. Some farmers are doing it with existing cultivation equipment, like this is sweeps and fingers mounted on the front, and then just their time meter on the back. So they're stacking like that with existing equipment. Mark here took his existing belly mounted side knives and he put tines on the back of the cultivator again, or back of the tractor, and it says it really, stacking these tools. If you're going to go through the field, you might as well, do as much soil disturbance and have the cultivator be as effective as possible. So in conclusion, the 3 tool combinations were the most effective, and sometimes you see finger weeders and the fingers are crossed, and there's these tines that are in the row, and that's just way too much disturbance to the crop. And in these trials, we gave the crop more room to breathe, and these tools were able to disturb the soil in the in-row zone without actually touching the crop. And I think that's the best way to go for in-row cultivation. But they really need accurate guidance. Kind of on the basic end of guidance systems, just front-mounted cultivator. You turn right, the cultivator actually goes right rather than rear end. Stekate, I think, makes these ones that Rob Johansson has here. There's a number of different belly-mounted systems. Of course, the old Alex Chalmers G is kind of the original. And there's some newer replacements of that, which are nice because you can look right down and it's got the engine in the back. So there's not much impeding your view of what's going on. This is the Hawk, or no, sorry, this is the Cult Press cultivator that I've worked with mostly, and it's got this rear kind of steering mechanism that has these kind kind of steering guide wheels that can adjust for any errors that the tractor operator can just kind of drive quickly, and it's all on this person to keep the cultivator and the tractor. And they make these up to 10, 12 rows, 30, 40 feet wide. And you want to match them to the width of your planter, so you're following the same rows as the planter does. Camera guidance is really handy if you're doing large acreage. I mean, you get a headache pretty quick staring down at the row, going by and by and by, and you're just kind of keeping everything centered. So camera guidance doesn't get tired. You can do it at night even, and it's pretty darn effective. This one on the left is from Garford out of the UK, and I think there's a distributor in Ontario. And then here's the Cult Crest unit out of Pennsylvania. Just to kind of sum up some of the pros and cons, or when you would use each of these. At the basic end, the front mounted and the belly mounted cultivators are really more for small scale, I think. The tractor pulled cultivators with the seed on the end, those, you can get some wide versions of those, so those can be used medium to large scale even, but it does require 2 people to cultivate, so that's a consideration. And then the camera guidance, 25 grand for the camera and the side shift unit, hydraulics and everything. And you can put it on your existing cultivator, but if you don't have one, then you'd have to buy a cultivator as well. So definitely the most expensive there. Aaron asked me to talk as well about cultivating in darkness, which can be useful. As we talked about briefly, weeds have various cues they take to tell them when to germinate, and light is one of them. They get a flash of sunlight. There's different chemical reactions in the plant that get going and tell it to germinate. And so, of course, when you're cultivating or when you're tilling, seeds that might have been buried that weren't getting that flash of sunlight, they get churned up, and even for a half a second, they see the sun and they get that cue to germinate. So if you're cultivating in darkness or with this some kind of cover, you don't get that cue to cultivate. And in some cases, this kind of dark cultivation can reduce the weed emergence by 50%. I think a lot of times it's closer to 0. It really depends on what species you have. Some species are very light sensitive to germinate, and some are insensitive. They're relying more on temperature or moisture or other factors than light. So it's kind of hit or miss with which species are affected by dark cultivation. When Chuck Moeller reviewed it in the book that everyone's been talking about, his conclusion was, it's probably not worth the extra effort to go out and cultivate at night as opposed to the day. So just overall, weed cultivation, it can be useful for a number of things. Aerating the soil, it's another tool in the toolbox to get some more nitrogen mobilization. It can disturb some slugs and things like that. But there's certainly some drawbacks. It can be expensive with new equipment. You can get some cultivator blight, as they say. Contribute to soil erosion, degrade soil health, and yeah, of course, if you're bringing up new weed seeds and doing it, exposing new seeds to sunlight, you're stimulating weed germination. Okay, so thanks everyone. And how much time do I have, Aaron? I've got a little bit more I could do depending on time. Okay, just if you're bored and you got 30 minutes, the slow motion video is pretty cool. And just another plug for that. And any questions on between row or in row cultivation? Yeah. Yeah, about rototillers. Yeah, so like a between row rototiller. Yeah, I think I think I typically see them called rotovaders when they're between row, but Yeah, they can be very effective. I think that they're more aggressive than just a regular between row cultivator. You know, they've got their PTO. Yeah, then they're PTO powered and they're doing more soil disturbance, probably fracturing and, you know, pulverizing the soil more. So it's creating a nice, you know, smooth, result when you're done with kind of a dust layer with, what did you say, a heat row?
No, I say we throw that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't think, you know, given how effective just regular row cultivators are, especially if the weeds are small, I don't think that there's a benefit to the rotavator unless the weeds are very large. You know, if they're hip high and you're going between the rows, I think the rotavator is gonna be useful there, but, you know, if they're less than knee high, I would just go with the, you know, regular between row cultivator.
You have a question? A couple minutes before the next speaker, they're finishing up at the next